Now we're going to talk about the muscular system, and it's got the obvious function of allowing animals to move, but it also is really important for heat production, and this is especially true for endotherms. And uh, posture and body support are also really critical, and they're not really movement, but you wouldn't even be able to sit up in a chair without your muscular system constantly making minor adjustments to maintain your posture. Um, Muscle cells all have some characteristics in common. They are irritable. That means that when they're stimulated, they will respond. They're contractile, which means that they can shorten. And of course, they shorten in response to an irritation or a stimulation. They're extensible, which means that when they're relaxed, they can be stretched back out to a resting shape. Now, muscles can only contract or relax. They can't push back out. So the way muscles are normally organized around a skeletal system is that they appear in opposing bunches. So when one muscle is relaxed, an opposing muscle can contract and stretch it back out. Muscles are also elastic, so when they're stretched and relaxed, they will spring back to a resting shape. They have a kind of a basic shape that they will spring back to if they're stretched. In vertebrates, there are three really different kinds of muscle tissue, and you can easily identify them if you see them in a microscope. It doesn't take very much practice to be able to do this. There's skeletal or striated muscle, which is the muscle that you use to move your skeleton, and this is the muscle that you basically have voluntary control over. And it's sometimes called striated muscle because it has striations on it that you can see in a microscope. And those striations are there because the proteins that make the muscle work, primarily actin and myosin, are so organized and lined up inside those muscle cells that you can actually see that structure just with a light microscope. So it's pretty amazing. Smooth muscle is not striated, and you do not have voluntary control over the contractions of smooth muscles. There's tons of smooth muscle in your gastrointestinal tract. When we talked about those muscle layers, the longitudinal layer and the circular layer of muscles in the GI tract, those are smooth muscles. You also have them in lots of other parts of your body, but probably more in the digestive tract than anywhere else. And then because you're a vertebrate, you also have a third type of muscle tissue called cardiac muscle, which makes up the muscle wall of the heart. And again, it's different from the other two. It's got a little bit of striation pattern on it, a little bit like skeletal muscle, but the proteins are not organized quite as well. But they are organized fairly well. So it does have a striated pattern, but the shape of the cells is very different from either smooth muscle or skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is made of long multinucleated cylinders that are separated from each other by connective tissue. And each of those cylinders is an individual cell, but each of them is as long as the muscle itself. So you think about the length of the muscles in your thigh. There are individual muscle cells that are that entire length. The same thing in your lower leg or in your arm. You've got some really long muscle cells in your body. Now they're not gigantic in diameter, but they are gigantic in terms of their length. And there's a problem with this because cells are basically regulated by chemical signals, mostly messenger RNA that's coming out of the nucleus. And those signals are really only diffusing out into the cell. If you can start to measure how long the cell is with a ruler, diffusion is happening so slowly at those distances that you can pretty much even forget about it. It's just happening too slowly to make a big difference. To get around this problem, skeletal muscles go through mitosis without going through cytokinesis, and in doing so, basically they keep making their nuclei divide, and so you wind up with a single cell that's really long, that's got thousands and thousands of nuclei along the length. And so each nucleus is basically responsible for a relatively short segment of the cell. So skeletal muscle is under voluntary control, and this is what you use to move your skeleton, to move the the muscles that are attached to your skeleton are all striated muscle. Striated muscle can contract really quickly. The the other kinds are actually have slower contraction. However, striated muscle is also fatigues sooner than the other one, so it can't maintain a contraction quite as long. The actin and myosin proteins that are basically the motor molecules of the muscle cell that allows it to contract are incredibly well organized in skeletal muscle, and you can see the striations in this picture. Those striations are there because the muscle, those proteins are so organized that you can actually see the pattern even with a light microscope. When you exercise, your muscles get bigger. However, you do not make any more muscle cells. What happens is the individual cells get bigger in diameter, and that's why your muscles get bigger. The muscle cell, skeletal muscle cells cannot divide by themselves. There are some stem cells called satellite cells that are associated with muscle cells that can divide and differentiate to produce some new muscle cells. However, you can't really fully repair major damage to a muscle. Minor damage you can, but you can't repair any major damage. So, when a surgeon has to get through a muscle to be able to reach something that they're operating on, they don't cut across the muscle. They cut the length of the muscle, because if you're cutting the length of the muscle, you're cutting very few of these muscle cells. For a skeletal muscle to contract, it needs a signal from a motor neuron. It needs a nerve impulse. And there are ways you can make a skeletal muscle cell contract artificially, but under normal circumstances, if you get rid of that nervous connection, that muscle is not going to ever contract again. So they are controlled directly by the nervous system. Smooth muscles are very different from skeletal muscles. So you're looking at a picture of smooth muscle cells here, and actually that is a picture from a slice through a digestive tract. And so you're seeing some of these muscles you're seeing are part of that circular layer, these here, and these are all oriented in this direction. The ones down in the bottom left-hand part of this picture are coming out of the screen towards you. So those are the longitudinal muscles in the digestive tract. These are sort of ordinarily shaped cells, sized cells. They are kind of spindle shaped. They kind of taper off towards the ends, and there's only one nucleus per cell. You do not have voluntary control over contraction of smooth muscle. They are under the control of the autonomic nervous system, and you don't have direct conscious control over that. So they're under involuntary control. When smooth muscle cells contract, they contract much slower than skeletal muscles, but they don't tire as quickly, so they can hold that contraction a lot longer. It's still the same proteins that are making the muscle contract. It's mostly actin and myosin, and then there's a couple of regulatory proteins that are in their control proteins. But the actin and myosin proteins are not so perfectly lined up. So you look at that picture, you're not seeing any of the striations. You're not seeing that fine banding pattern that you saw with skeletal muscles. As I said, there's lots of smooth muscle in the GI tract. You also have it in respiratory passages, and when these smooth muscles start contracting when they shouldn't, that can give you asthma because it's starting to close off some of these little air passages and you're not able to ventilate your lungs the way you should. They're also found in the reproductive tract, they're in the urinary tract, and they're also in arteries. And so it's smooth muscles can contract. They're little rings of smooth muscles around arteries that are controlling the blood flow into certain areas of your body, into capillary beds, so they can shut down the flow or open up and release more blood into certain areas of your body. These cells are able to do mitosis and divide and cytokinesis. So after an injury, these can recover pretty well because they can replace themselves. They can make new ones. The contraction is either in response to neural activity from part of the nervous system that you do not have direct conscious control over, or they can contract just by themselves. So either way. The smooth muscle cells are bound together into contractile units. So it's a whole unit that contracts when that happens. The smooth muscle cells can send signals from one to another. So if one starts contracting, this basically they can communicate with the other cells that are touching them so that they know to contract also. But they tend to be kind of slow. So cardiac muscle is in the middle in terms of speed. Smooth muscle contractions are very slow, skeletal muscle contractions are very fast, and cardiac muscle contractions are kind of in the middle. All right, cardiac muscle, you only find invertebrates. You've got the three types. Invertebrates have smooth muscle and striated muscle, but they do not have cardiac muscle. And obviously the place you find cardiac muscle is in the heart. This is what's making up the contractile wall of the heart. They're striated a bit like skeletal muscle, and if you look closely, you can see the striations in these pictures, but it's not quite as distinct. The pattern is a bit different. The striations are very obvious and very distinct in striated muscle. They're there in cardiac muscle, but they're not quite as obvious. You can tell the difference just at a glance. Cardiac muscle cells are branched. It's a little bit hard to see that, but in the upper picture, it's got a place where you can see a branch that's labeled, and it's got a cartoon that kind of shows it a little bit more clearly. And unlike smooth muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells are really only attached to other cardiac muscle cells at the ends. Smooth muscle cells are kind of stuck to all the other smooth muscle cells around them all along their entire length. These are really only attached at the ends, and that point of attachment is really important because obviously you can imagine if you start getting these muscles contracting and the connection between them isn't very strong, they can start ripping apart, which would be a big problem. But also the signal of the contraction, when one muscle cell starts contracting, it's got to be able to signal the next one in the line to start contracting. So you need a strong connection between the cells, but you also need to be able for that signal to communicate from one cell to the next. And that is done by a structure called intercalated discs. And you can see them on these pictures. In 3 dimensions, they are disc shaped. You're kind of looking at them on edge, so they look like dark lines between the cells. And there are a couple labeled in the upper picture, and you can see them a little bit closer up in the lower picture. Those dark lines that go across the cells are the intercalated discs. These also are kind of normal size cells, 1 nucleus per cell. These just can't divide after an injury, so you don't get any repair. That means after something like a heart attack where you may have lost some cardiac muscle cells, that's permanent. You can't replace them. It does look like they've in the lab they've been able to manipulate some stem cells and make them differentiate into cardiac muscle cells. So it's not impossible that at some point in the future we would have some sort of therapy that would allow you to grow new cardiac muscle cells, but it won't happen by itself. And we can't really do it now. There are no therapies that are going to do this at this point, but in the future, maybe. Cardiac muscle cells are odd. They're different than other kinds of muscle cells, not just in their appearance, but also in terms of how they function. So for other cells in your body, you usually get a contraction when there's a nerve impulse. I mean, that's basically always the case with skeletal muscle, and even with smooth muscle, that's usually the case. In cardiac muscle, that is not true. Cardiac muscle cells, in addition to contracting like a muscle would, you also have a system in them that is a little bit like a nervous system. And all muscle cells can do this to a certain extent. They can kind of communicate with one another and send something similar to nerve impulses from one to another. But cardiac muscle cells are really good at it. So your heart beats, well, if you're in pretty good shape, your heart is going to beat about once a second. If you're not in pretty good shape, it's beating a little bit faster than that. But the odd thing is that you don't need a nerve impulse to make your heart beat each time. You do have a connection between your nervous system and your heart, and that connection can speed up your heart rate or slow down your heart rate. And again, it's an autonomic control, so you don't have direct conscious control over that. But even if you were to go in and cut those nerves completely, your heart would just keep right on beating. And the reason it would do that is that there are some specialized heart muscle cells called pacemaker cells, and those pacemaker cells set up the basic pulse rate of your heart. And because these heart muscle cells are really good at basically communicating with one another, these pacemaker cells set up a beat rate of about once a second. And as they contract, that signal propagates to all the other cells around them, and so very quickly the entire heart is contracting. So you get a heartbeat that way. So really an odd system. Like I say, nerve impulses influence your heart rate, but you don't have a nerve impulse for each heartbeat. Those nerve impulses can just speed up the overall rate or slow down the overall rate. The heart itself sets up the basic pulse rate.